Raul Kumar, who comes via an acquisition, and Jessica Robinson, who comes via Zipcar and runs policy for Ford. Um, what's remarkable is I don't know of a company in kind of American corporate landscape, of a big American company, that has so wholesale embraced change and has tried to kind of pivot its direction as much as Ford. I mean, a couple of years ago, Bill Ford said, we need to get into the smart mobility business. And a lot of other people at Ford said, no, we make cars. And there's a certain amount of momentum or inertia to being a big vehicle manufacturer. But it was clear that the whole nature of the car and the economy was changing. And this has to be as big a change as any that's going on. Last year here at South by, Bill Ford laid a lot of that strategy out. Shortly after South by, there was a new CEO who came in, Jim Hackett, who this year at CES laid out a vision of cities that wasn't just, okay, there's going to be on-demand mobility on autonomy, but it really looked like you were thinking through the second-order effects of all this. How would street life change? If we're going to make this kind of wholesale change, how do we make sure it's more inclusive and we don't kind of have the kind of effects that the automobile had, which creates sprawl and problems? So it looks like there's a consciousness to all of this. So you're in a city solutions group at Ford, which sounds like you're both consulting to cities, but you're learning an awful lot from cities about what they need that feeds back into products. So just give us a sense for both what that means, and also Ford's created a whole bunch of new entities like FordX and City Solutions to deal with all this.
Yep, great. Thank you, Peter. So there was a lot there, so I'm going to try and remember all of those points. I think where we should start is where we began as a company, which is as an automaker, right? And in the time and place, we were, in many ways, the ultimate disruptor. Henry Ford had this vision of opening the highways to all mankind. What's interesting is we didn't actually have highways at that point because we didn't have the car yet. But whether it's blockchain or self-driving vehicles, we are on the verge of a new transformation in technology. And so the work that we do on City Solutions is actually at the nexus of two sets of transformations, both for our company and for cities and how cities operate and administer their government. And so that's why we set up this group specifically, was to be that bridge and that marrying point between, again, two organizations going through tremendous change. You mentioned Jim Hackett. Jim was actually he stepped off of Ford Motor Company board to be the chairman of Ford Smart Mobility, and now he's back with Ford as the CEO. What we see where that plays out every day is in the way we do business. And Jim, from his time at Steelcase, helped that company re-envision what the office looks like. Now we're doing the same for how we move around. So it's dramatically changed how we think about our business, whether it's business model technologies we should go after, or how we understand our customer. You also mentioned some of the acquisitions and moves that we've made. I am part of a separate LLC. Ford set that up as a way for a group of us to go and run and operate more quickly. We grew through acquisitions, companies like Chariot and Transloc. We've stood up new businesses focused on microtransit for non-emergency medical transportation. We actually have fleet services as well. And Ford's vision really moving into the future is twofold. Rather than being disruptive again to a city and maybe letting the implications or effects of technology go unchecked, we actually want to work together to make sure that the new set of technologies fit. But why Ford, where we see ourselves fitting, is with solutions across the transportation stack, if you will. So vehicle for sure, infrastructure, absolutely, the software that powers that, and self-driving technology as well. So I don't know if I got everything. We can come back to that, I'm sure.
This points out kind of what an integrated vision this has to be. It's like it's no longer these are automobiles and that's a city and what happens. You're having to take on the fact that it's a platform. You need developers for the platform. You want to work with cities so that the way that solutions are implemented, street life is better. So if there's an event, cars are automatically diverted. So it becomes a more integrated vision. And your background's interesting because you come from Techstars, which is kind of a classic innovation mechanism, and then you were at Zipcar where you were implementing stuff in cities. So it also sounds like you're doing projects in cities to kind of help cities have better deployment as a city, but that must feed back into Ford in terms of what you're learning about what cities need, and that's kind of a different model.
It does, yeah. And there's a question with the last panel about, is it just the technology or is it a business model? For us, we also asked the question of what does it mean for the communities? And that comes, in part from my prior experience in mobility solutions, but also, Techstars, any startup knows you have to focus on the customer or you're going to be out of business in 4 weeks. And so where this all kind of starts to come and marry together is recognizing that we have to do things differently, work together, but also recognize that in order to, so much said and so many books written about innovation at big companies. It's really, really freaking hard to actually do this. Whether it's walking the halls, convincing your colleagues that have been there a while that we need to do things differently. And so our group kind of carries the banner of that as well.
It's a truism. We live in a time of kind of existential change and fundamental, quantum disruptive. But the auto industry kind of did go through this once. In the late 1930s, at the 39 World's Fair, Ford and GM showed up and they had a vision. They had a vision of the city of tomorrow, and they basically launched highways, the suburbs, kind of suburban housing, and what we now know is the recently past 20th century model of urbanism. And it was
Don't throw the tomatoes.
But no, but the point was, it was a very willful architectural point. And we're at a similar pivot point now because of the change to autonomy, because you're adding AI to the whole thing, because of on-demand. Yes, there's the existential problem if we don't use cars like we used to. But to the degree that architecture is destiny, it's very clear if you get it right, cities are better. And if you get it wrong, more urban annoyance, right? So it's very important. Raul, you and I met. Raul and I met a year ago because I'm on the board of his company, which has since been acquired by Ford. So we all kind of went through that whole journey together. What's fascinating about Transloc is it does on-demand mobility. And I'd like you to describe that a little bit, but this is really a category. This is basically creating on-demand on-demand solutions for transit agencies, and transit agencies aren't the most innovative people in the world because you're a government, right? And you're not really paid to take risks. And transit agency IT people aren't that innovative either. You put the two of them together, and it takes a special sauce to kind of get them to do something very new. But then Uber came along, and suddenly there was competition. So talk to me a little bit about, and we get into all this because this gets us right into distributed solutions and then onto blockchain.
Sure. I think Jessica hit the nail on the head on a number of things, but the toughest thing when you're working with cities and governments is you have to evangelize an idea, and there is a high amount of risk aversion that's just kind of built into that B2G space. And so what we really found, and I come from a background of public transportation, community involvement, marketing, and a little bit of technology and innovation. What we really found was that, yes, Uber and Lyft and these transportation software companies had come in and disrupted these cities and agencies, but cities and agencies still had the lion's share of the market. 10 billion trips are taken on public transit every year in the U.S. alone. The average person spends about an hour a day in the U.S. on public transit. So there's a captive market there. So our approach was, like Jessica said, to really involve and work from within the city out. Because one thing that has changed is the consumer expectation. You and I, we take a Lyft or an Uber to get to where we're going because it's simple and easy to use. Well, the market could not meet that expectation. So that was really our approach, to go in and say, there's this consumer sentiment and expectation. Let us help you with technology, but not just technology, sound operations, social change, behavioral characteristic changes, and then the deep analytics that are necessary to make those things a reality.
To make this specific, can you describe what is microtransit? What piece of metals run around the city, and how do I get it, and what does it do for me?
Yeah. So microtransit is more of a concept than it is anything else. We're trying to blur the lines between transit and transportation modes. A lot of folks are talking about cars and subways and buses and Ubers and Lyfts. We want to make all that go away and eventually come down to a flexible, demand-driven mode of transportation. And that's where we really came up with microtransit. It's not a new thing. It's been around since jitneys were run on Fifth Avenue in the early 20th century. But our concept specifically is we work with cities. We try to figure out where the most pressing problems are. Where are they not able to meet the needs of people who travel in and around their city? And as a result, there's increased congestion, limited access to jobs, inability to get to hospitals and doctor's appointments, inability for students to get to work, so the students get to school. So our desire isn't to say, look at this technology, look at what it can do for you. We try to ask the question, hey, what is going on and how can something be fixed? And then from there, we actually have built a simulator that before a city spends a single dime can actually see what net impact the city will have just by deploying a new demand-driven form of transportation. And once that's deployed, it's like 3 to 6 months. It's not this year-long process. The beauty about it is that it is flexible. So as people move in and out of a city, as new employers come in, as new housing developments are built, as new, like in the case of Las Vegas, there's this, the Raiders are coming to town. The goal there is to really focus on something that's flexible and not fixed.
I want to unpack it a little bit. Interesting to see where this came from. If you look at where did microtransit come from, some of the original clients were schools where you had to get women home safely at night, right? So you're going from
Students home safely.
Anybody.
Everyone.
Students, right.
Yeah.
You had to get home safely at night. So you had to go from any random classroom to any random dorm on demand. And so then that was like, it turns out that could be useful in general for corporate campuses. And then, well, how about putting that in cities? So kind of that, it scaled up like that. And then the other fascinating thing that kind of went on this year was the simulator. So if you're trying to sell a solution to a city, there's the RFP, and then it takes forever, and then you're winning with someone, and okay. What if you could sell it by the route? Literally a la carte. Now, I resonated with this because years ago I was at Apple Computer, and we could not sell, back in the olden days, to giant corporations because they liked IBM. But we could sell to individuals and departments. And then they got addicted, and then they all had to buy. Well, it looks like that was kind of the strategy that's going on here.
Sure.
So where the simulator comes in is if you ingest lots and lots of data and you apply some machine learning to things, you can see where there's a transportation desert. Like you could see, nobody knows it, but it's really expensive to get from here to here. People are being underserved, and if you only put a route in there when they needed it, your subsidy would go down, your response would go up, people would be happier, and you would not get fired. And that's basically the piece of software that you build.
That's right. That's right. I mean, the risk that folks have in cities, their jobs are hard. They've got 10 million things to do day in and day out. So when you're going into talking, and Jessica, I know, can speak to this better than I can. It's that when you're talking to folks and you're talking about a real world problem, it's not that they are not aware of the problem, is that they don't know where to start asking the right questions. They don't know, there's 10 million technologists that are out there that can come in and hawk somewhere or another that can supposedly solve those problems. But to de-risk the situation from the get-go was a critical part of our go-to-market strategy, simply because it was how, when I was on the other side of the table, that's what I wanted to know. I wanted to know what would make my life the easiest and make me look the best. And that's who I went with.
Here's a really poignant example. NPR was doing a story on Erie, Pennsylvania, which was kind of ground zero for a lot of the real upset in America, and one of the reasons there's a lot of interest in Trump and manufacturing and stuff like that. So in Erie, they chronicled a single mom, and she explained that there were jobs, she could get jobs, but the minute she told her employer that she was going to take the bus to work, they didn't want to hire her because they knew the bus meant unreliable and forget about it. But like on-demand can kind of deal with that. So this suggests very distributed solutions, and it's almost a hop, skip, and a jump from there to imagine a blockchain solution where instead of some central provider, people are expressing their needs, solutions get synthesized. So where are some of the places that you're thinking of blockchain applying, or it might apply as we're moving out into this future?
Do you want to take it first?
Yeah, I'll take that first. I think a related question is how open will these systems be in the future? And for many companies that have kind of been the V1 or V2 in mobility disruption, the value created has been at the coordination layer. Mm-hmm. So I think fundamentally we are going to see a disruption in business models where maybe you won't get to take a 5 or 10% cut or 10 cents of every transaction. because you no longer get to sit at that cross point or that juncture. So I think it poses lots of questions for business models in the future. For us, one of the things we announced recently is this idea of a transportation mobility cloud. There's lots of ideas about clouds and interface layers. Related to that is, I think where blockchain for us will become in mobility rather than car ownership will come first, it's very likely in trust and tokens between enterprise partners, and potentially as an interface with the city. We have companies of our size, we have long-standing histories of working with companies like Microsoft and IBM and Cisco, but those are highly negotiated deals. One-off takes months and months and months and months. We're not going to then let GM or Renault into our little world that we've created, because again, that's how we've created value for ourselves. I think with blockchain, there's going to be this expectation that big companies work together, or there is already an expectation, and blockchain can then facilitate it. I would like to maybe suggest something for Raul, if you want to go there. One of the biggest, most screwed up things in cities right now is public transportation fares.
Yep.
So if anyone wants a really, really hard problem to work on, an application of blockchain, that would be one I would love to see.
Yeah, I mean, I did my master's thesis on fare policy in 2006, and nothing has changed. I mean, we're 12 years later. I think we really need to look at mobility democratization. That's one of the things that Uber and Lyft and Chariot and others, and I mean, it's so cool to hear a Fortune 50 company like Ford thinking about stuff like that. That really the freedom to move is something that blockchain can do. If we can actually have this distributed marketplace that is governed and regulated, but really have the city at the center of it. Have the city say, we don't want congestion, so we're going to incentivize people moving along different corridors or using different models of movement. If we say that, to Jessica's point, with transit fares, if you said, well, if you ride during off-peak, because you don't have to go to and from a job, you may pay less. Or if you ride during peak, you may pay a little bit more. There's so many ways of doing things. I'd even look at another model. One of the businesses that Ford stood up is non-emergency medical transportation. On average, these trips cost about $60 to $80 a ride. Can you imagine that? Going 12 miles and paying 60 to 80 bucks. And that's covered through Medicare.
But could you say that again? What costs 60 to 80 bucks?
One trip going one direction.
So the actual loaded cost of a bus trip, by the time you put all that Fargus in, was 60 to 80 bucks.
Yeah, and these are folks that are both ambulatory and non-ambulatory. These are folks that are going to dialysis or to doctor's appointments. It is not an emergency trip, right? Not by ambulance. But there's still a very specific need for these folks to go. Now, one of the reasons why is that these are very highly coordinated trips. They're funded usually by Medicare. There's a lot of HIPAA restrictions that are involved. There's a lot of coordination between centers that actually house patients, the doctor's offices. Now, what if you just put a blockchain underlying layer there that could guarantee the transactions and the negotiations would happen, and then leave it to the marketplace as long as they met certain criteria to provide those services? You could bring down the cost of those trips to the patients, to the insurance companies, to the states significantly.
This gets to the core of kind of the ideological aspiration of blockchain, right? Which is tied so much to kind of early open web aspirations. Then it also gets an interesting role of the public sector here, right? So the objective function of an Uber or Lyft is shareholder value. And the objective function of a government, ideally, is satisfying the most citizens. And so that's why government transportation groups have to serve everybody. And one of the reasons that there's this relationship with Transloc, and also I think a lot of what Ford is looking at, which is at the end, this gets to, we understand there can be all of these network effects that concentrate wealth. So how do we get ahead of that?
Sure.
And it's almost, I think that feels like a lot of the spirit of what you guys are trying to work through and think about.
Can you guys add to the problem set of how many agencies are involved in that situation, that $60 to $80? Because in order for someone to solve this problem, they have to know the business model that has to be reinvented. And so if there's a consortium of 60 agencies sharing one shared database versus 60 siloed databases, and you can speed up the information flow and reduce the correspondence
Sure.
Ford has already looked at, and how could we put that out so that people watching this later could go, oh my God, I got the solution for that, and find you.
I can tell a story on the part of the providers in the states, and I think maybe it makes sense from Go Ride's point of view. Now, so we launched a non-emergency medical transportation. It's called a brokerage, which is essentially another term for blockchain. What we would do is negotiate with up to 800 different providers, and this is the state of Nebraska, not exactly a highly dense state. 800 different providers on a weekly basis that would say, you have to charge for this short of a trip, if it's an ambulatory person, this much per mile. We, as the brokerage, would take a cut of that. We would have to make sure we get reimbursement from Medicare. Medicare we would then pass that through along to the provider. But that's the easy part. Now all of a sudden, if you have co-pays and you have patient responsibilities, and then you have the centers that house these patients, you've got this underlying grid of maybe 4 to 5 different actors, if you include funding sources, for one 8 to 10 mile commute. And that commute, in cases of dialysis, folks who need dialysis are there 2 times a week. So it's a set subscription demand, right? You know where people are going, you know how frequently they're going to use it, you know how long they're going to be gone. So in most cases, it is predictable, but here's where it goes to shit, is where the states only measure active usage, and people are getting older. People need these services more. And so there's never enough money in the system because of the true cost of operations. So.
Yeah. I guess to add to that, at the macro and even maybe the personal level. So, I mean, there's typically the healthcare facility itself. There's been consolidation there, so maybe you're lucky and you get one that has multiple locations. A lot of the operators of the vehicles themselves are mom and pops. So maybe they have 3, 5 vans. They're dealing with individual drivers contracted out. Personal level, my dad's actually in a wheelchair and he uses this type of service to get around. Then you have a family member who's trying to coordinate trips back and forth. You might have an assisted living facility that's managing this as well. Again, if you get lucky from an efficiency perspective, it's a chain again as well. Maybe some of this, there's a prescription element involved, so now you're dealing with an individual doctor. Of course, you've got healthcare. If you're talking about Medicare, Medicaid, you've got now multiple public entities administering this. So there's lots and lots of inefficiencies in this entire system. Yeah.
And then you have companions.
That's right. Yeah.
So we've described kind of 2 ecosystems with lots of players, right? So on the one hand, Ford works with lots of other companies, and just as in Web 2.0, API simplified transactions, so you didn't need all these biz dev people. Now we're talking about tokens further simplifying it and further compensating it. And then we're also talked about this remarkably complex thing around disabled and elderly and stuff like that. How do you see kind of Ford leading a platform in all of this? Because there's always the tension between, we're a company that's proprietary, and yet there's something very open here, and yet it feels like platform and partners is just a really big part of the vehicle. That's the wrong term, but the mechanism going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I mentioned the mobility cloud. I think that's a place, and embedded in that again is this aspiration to connect across layers. And I think if you follow our company or the auto industry more broadly, the aspiration to this point has been connect the vehicles, V to X. So connect the vehicles maybe to infrastructure, maybe to one another. But that's kind of as far as our imaginations have gone. Now we're talking about pedestrian-generated data or things like that. So it goes much further. Your question about how proprietary or not, I think I still see all of us kind of grappling through that. We recognize that openness is the way forward, yet our DNA and our history has always told us, put up the wall. Our business schools teach us this: put up the walls and make sure the competitors can't get in. I think this requires fundamentally a shift in understanding of where we're creating value. Something you didn't mention about me, I actually studied anthropology in school, and one of the things that I think about when we, being in tech, when we talk so much about platform we instantly leap to how are the machines talking to each other, what's the
No.
technology that's making this happen. There is fundamentally still a human layer to this, and we as technologists and people in this space are actually a platform too, and that's something Ford is thinking about as well, is how do we physically bring people, entities together to work on these solutions, whether it's through events or challenges in the community, because I think that's as much of a platform
Yeah.
as anything else, and I also believe that's how we will become more comfortable with this idea of collaborating.
And if there's one thing that urban planning has learned, it's you do it with people and not at people, or else you get in a lot of trouble. And so essentially as the borders between we're a vehicle company and we're essentially making the stuff that helps plan a city, it kind of really requires a lot of that.
Absolutely.
We're probably, who's in charge of keeping time?
We're in good shape, we got questions.
Okay, good. So let's go, why don't we, this is probably a good time to go to questions then? All right.
Now we eat some deviled eggs and have some drinks.
That's completely fabulous. First of all, this is great. You guys.
I like the way
just-
Chris works.
I did.
I really do.
Great insight into kind of how you're thinking about stuff.
That
And,
white noise you hear is stomach
His
growling.
and now we'd like to hear from the very stomachs themselves. Yes.
Here's what my stomach has to ask. Does the city simulator exist? Is it live and available to share with cities?
Uh-huh.
And how do we access it? How many cities do you want participating? Like, how can we?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, and Ford is doing a lot of cool things with simulations as well. From the transportation side of the business where we work, the city simulator's been live and running for almost a year now. We have run simulations in 23 cities so far, I believe, in the U.S. Yeah. Well, a couple in Canada, and then we're actually working on one in Saudi Arabia too. So it's everything is up and running, and how it works is the simulator is part and parcel of this overall microtransit technology that we roll out. So it is step 1 of 3 before it goes out.
So how have cities reacted? What
Yeah.
have you learned? What's kind of been the happen last year?
Yeah, you know, that's an awesome question because that's probably been the most revealing for us, which is that cities have this desire and need to understand how people move. They just have never really been able to figure out how to do it. There's transportation demand forecasting. There's $1 million a year consultants that are out there that can tell them the same thing. But they've never been able to do it with such little effort on their part with such remarkable results because it's basically soup to nuts. What's wrong? Here's how to fix it. Here's how much it's going to cost. So it's probably in the 20 years I've been in the public transportation space, I've never seen anything that's had this kind of an uptick.
What data do you ingest to do that?
Really lots of things. So we do some data fusion where we'll look at economic development departments and what their forecasts are for housing and businesses. We'll look at simple things like bus transit ridership. We'll talk to meeting and gathering locations like churches and schools and figure out what times those folks are. It's not, I hate to say this because our data science people will kill me, but it's not that scientific of a process on the input side. Now, once all of that is ingested, fused and ingested, that is a rigorous machine learning algorithm that runs, and it's the same algorithm that runs on the street. So how a person requests a vehicle today using our application is the same that is used in the simulator.
So we're looking at like a military use case and all the military vehicles, and they're not cities, we're talking war zones here. So different use case, but similar opportunities. But one of the things we're seeing is to be able to solve some of these challenges, we want to look harder at sourcing. So I know you're talking a lot of Ford taking leadership in the auto industry. What is the auto industry doing collectively versus what Ford itself is doing that can maybe propel this?
Yeah, no, I'd be glad to speak to that. One of the things about working in a highly regulated industry is that we've actually learned how to work together with our competitors in many cases. This is something my auto colleagues have taught me. And there are actually many consortia that we're a member of, whether it's a 5G alliance looking at wireless in addition to DSRC between vehicles. We are actually also a member of a blockchain consortium. And so our researchers are thinking about how that applies as well. There's lots of things in terms of safety and standards that we do. And I would say this is kind of one of those institutional things. If there's a place where auto mobility companies should be looking that we're maybe not a part of. I think what I sense from my colleagues is we're very open to thinking about potential applications for our technology. We and all automakers have a history of selling vehicles to governments, whether it's city, state, or GSA, the defense. I think the question now is, as we reinvent our own businesses collectively in the industry, how does that then transcend into the federal government as well?
So you're looking at industry level services versus just Ford only?
Absolutely. Yeah, we have to.
Okay, we got 3 questions coming over here. You, sir, in the 4th row.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm concerned about the intersectionality between public and private sectors on the same train of thought. The previous panelists talked about kind of a woman on the street perspective, right? I'm driving my Ford F-150, or I'm coming from a property street. How does my car see the signal to pay for parking, right? On the very small level, everyday people, right? So that to me is quite important. I'd love to hear both your perspectives.
The challenge there, just to be frank, is you need whoever's administering the infrastructure and the technology on the city side to have something compatible. And our colleagues in parking technology have actually done a lot there in terms of apps and things. I think the next phase, specifically with your example of how might your vehicle pay for parking, it would require that standard between the two. It certainly could be built on blockchain. I know Renaud mentioned we're looking at also having a wallet attached to your vehicle. The question then is, does a city now, I'm a taxpayer, the question I would ask my leaders is, are you now dealing with integrating with the Bluetooth, the Blu-ray, VHS, and DVD equivalent of vehicle payment systems, or as an industry, have we come to some consensus that there's one mechanism? Parking, I'll pause there. There's a lot more I could answer.
Well, since I'm not an executive at Ford, I'm an executive at Transloc. I'll go completely off the reservation and say I think parking meters and signals are dinosaurs. I think
that's where I wanted to go.
Yeah. I honestly believe that the more we try to solve those kind of issues, the less that we can actually get at the true innovation of redesigning cities. 40% of Los Angeles County is a goddamn parking spot. Okay? A parking spot. Well, which is also a parking spot from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day. It's ridiculous. We cannot live in cities that function the way they do. And we have, unfortunately, oversupplied our cities with modes of transportation, right? And one of the great things that Ford is doing is, as a mobility company, they're not worrying about the individual passenger car. We're worrying about moving wide swaths of people from where they want to go to where they need to go. Now, with the gig economy and the global on-demand market, we know that people have shifted the way they move, and that's where our analytics come in to better understand that. So, that's where I think that public-private partnership really comes into play. So, not to be glib on your question, I think that we have to really start looking. We don't want to solve 20th century problems today.
Now that you cracked that open. One of the other projects that we have actually been involved in, there's in city tech space, there's this emerging idea of curb management. And it actually goes, I think, to bigger questions of understanding of public assets and how they're utilized moving forward. We have a project in London which started as parking and an app, but what we quickly discovered and are seeing pretty much around the world is that to administer efficient parking or a more efficient use of space, it requires better data and information about what's in place today. So that's actually work that we're doing now, kind of underlying and getting at some of the planning things that Raul mentioned.
You, sir. We got it handled. Great. Adrian?
So on the previous panel, they mentioned CryptoKitties, and also in Bitcoin, the mining fees just went crazy one day, and it just ground everything to a halt. How can you ensure that if I'm paying
that somehow or other the network fees don't become so atrocious that it just stops working.
I don't know. I mean, there's an element of the marketplace, right? And I think we see that today with TNCs or cost to ship a package. I don't know.
I don't have the foggiest idea. I mean, the marketplace exists to generate income for people in the marketplace. So there is going to be inherently some need for that marketplace to have some fees. Is it going to be a capitalist market or is it going to be a social market?
I mean,
$7
but-
to send 13 cents or something.
All right, well, broadly
I totally
speaking,
agree.
the market's not going to like really expensive, ever more expensive blockchain solutions. There's a ton of innovation going on to make sure that economy gets handled. I think the bigger point is also that, if you thought of Stephen Johnson's article in the New York Times recently, as you pointed out, getting the intermediary out or creating artificial monopoly fees around coordination, you can get that out. So the hope would be that more of the revenue goes to people who actually provide service, which makes the gig economy work even better. Why don't we wrap up? So much of this really has to do with streets and quality of life. And I was impressed that in Hackett's CES talk, it really came to that. In San Francisco, we're in the process of redesigning Market Street. It's our main drag. It's one of the widest streets in America. And one thing it doesn't have is a lot of civic engagement. If you do the measurements, people dash to the bus or whatever. We did a project there recently called Urban Prototyping, where we repressed the city planning laws. We made all this go away, and we had 50 teams compete to build interesting stuff in the street that increased dwell time, interactivity between different classes and ages and stuff, and then we measured the hell out of it, and we used that as an input into a reimagined Market Street without cars and without parking. And it was a lovely kind of dialogue, and we did it twice, because the first time we only included part of the community, and we got that wrong, and then we did more of everybody. But it feels like that side of things, which is kind of engaging the community in their design of the cities, is now part and parcel with designing kind of a company that's a great transportation company. It's a very different view of the world.
Yeah, so I guess just to comment that if you didn't see us at CES, but if you'd been there, what you would have seen is bike lanes, people doing hopscotch in a virtual street, smart parking benches, and even for some of my colleagues, their minds were just kind of blown. I think what it gets to for us is this fundamental recognition that the world is changing for the better, and the application of technology has to facilitate that. And so that is a guiding principle from Jim all the way down. I'll just leave it there. Completely agree.
Robert Moses would be very, very unhappy with you.
Well,
I
Robert
know.
Moses also built expressway bridges, so the people from those parts of the city couldn't get into Long Island. So,
And that's clearly a whole other conversation.
Right.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.